In this second episode on Christian theology, I'm joined once again by Daniel Schwindt. In this episode, we discuss his book, Catholic Social Teaching, A New Synthesis, Rerum Novarum to Laudato Si. I'd like to say a big thank you to my paid patrons and subscribers for making all of this work possible, and if you would like to support Hermitix or gain access to some exclusive content, then please find links in the description below. Otherwise, please enjoy. So, Daniel Schwindt, thanks very much for joining us once again on Hermitix podcast.
Thank you.
We're going to be talking about, in this second theological chat, we're talking about a book you published in 2015 called Catholic Social Teaching, A New Synthesis, Rerum Novarum to Laudato Si. And this is a book really which basically wants to, as it is in the title, a written new synthesis of Catholic social teaching, but sort of inclusive of all the debates which have been going on around, say, Vatican II and Pope Francis, and doing it from what I'd consider an extremely level-headed position, which manages to include multiple camps of people that are often difficult to include in a sensible way. So it's sort of like, if you're a traditionalist but still wants to be around this discussion of what's going on with Pope Francis and Vatican II, then the book approaches this in a really accessible way. And I thought it was a really great book, just in terms of that, but it's also a fantastic text as an introduction to Catholic social teaching, throughout the ages and split into all these themes. But I'll just open it up. Why did you write this book?
Well, thank you. And I'd say the motivation for writing was, somewhat what it sounds like I achieved in what you're describing. But it was, I've always struggled with alienation from the political scene, from those conversations about social issues, because, for me here in the United States, it's Republicans against the Democrats, and their platforms, are kind of totalizing, so that you're either a Democrat or you're a Republican, and if you say, if you try to convey an idea that's not democratic, then you must be a Republican, and that's kind of exhaustive of the whole spectrum of political ideas. And I had struggled because, in some areas I saw overlap where, I wanted to say, why not both? And then there was other areas where I wanted to say, neither. I don't want to have anything to do with that, particular idea being proposed on either side. And at a certain point, I decided to start taking Catholicism seriously. I started reading a lot. And when I stumbled upon Catholic social teaching in the form of, a series of encyclicals over a very long period of time, which is really what Catholic social teaching is from a doctrinal standpoint. It's just a category of encyclicals and statements and documents produced by the Church addressing social and economic questions. And when I kind of, I guess, quote, discovered that category of teachings, it was wonderful for me, because I finally felt like I had found something that was sort of over and above party politics. And so it's not really a replacement. There's not like a Catholic social teaching party, and that would be probably a pretty bad idea to reduce it to that. But it really was able to provide me with, I guess, a framework of principles to use to edify me in some areas, but also just help to navigate all of those questions, all of those political and economic discussions, and to have kind of some backing and guidance, so that you don't feel like you're in no man's land, and that reassurance that, if you're Catholic, this is a long-standing set of teachings, and so it's very empowering, I suppose. And the writing of this book was to try and reach out to mostly Catholic audiences, obviously. And I tried to, again, take a fairly balanced approach, and just sort of introduce that content to anyone who may have, lived for a long time in the Catholic world without ever maybe knowing that it existed. And, I knew there were other people like me who may have struggled and felt like they had to go, red or blue and to provide an alternative, or at least a more comprehensive and coherent framework to formulate those opinions.
Mm-hmm. And I guess, as you say about taking Catholicism seriously, it's sort of a relief in a way to know that there is this long historical tradition. We have scripture and tradition. We have the Bible, and we also have the Catechism, and we also have Catholic social teaching, which I guess would be included in tradition. And it's sort of comforting to know it's there, because in relation to what you're talking about in terms of red and blue, I mean, of course, many reds would say that they do have God on their side, so to speak, and I imagine many blues would as well. But outside of this, once you get to real Catholic social teaching, of course, these teachings aren't based on political fashions or social or purely material or worldly affairs. These teachings begin from the divine foundation, which itself then sort of pulls them out of this contemporary culture of relativism, right? So you don't want to say it's a third option, because it's sort of, if you are a Catholic or if you are a Christian, then it's sort of almost the only option, right? Because it's the one that's tethered to the actual foundation of the divine.
Yes. I mean, the Catholic Church would say these are simply elaborations, developments of the gospel, of the revelation that was given to Christians, so that in a way, it's the standard by which all novel ideas ought to be compared. And that's really the confidence that it can give you, is that, this isn't just, let's say it's an encyclical from Pope Francis. It's not just Pope Francis's hot take on, some current issue. Almost every time, and especially if it's in an officially, promulgated document, you can trace it back hundreds of years, the idea, so that you can rest assured and verify for yourself how these ideas and these principles that are contained in Catholic social teaching predated almost all of the problems that we're familiar with. And it's almost a question of, we forgot the answers and forgot that the answers were even there, and so now we're trying to solve them anew.
It's always the way that eventually everything sort of, I don't want to say like horseshoes itself around, but it does seem that way, that every social problem that we have horseshoes itself around, and eventually you see the solution, which, people begrudgingly have to accept, and you sort of say, yeah, that was there all along, right? You just didn't want to admit to the fact that that for some reason in the Western world at the moment there is this sort of push against Christianity, I would say, and often in favor of other things, and eventually people sort of admit and go, okay, they were right all along.
yeah, and to some extent, even for Christians, I wouldn't even put the blame entirely at their feet, because for generations it has been almost doctrinal from a cultural standpoint that religious ideas are compartmentalized, and they don't really have much to say about politics and economics, and to bring it into those discussions is to, I guess, degrade, lofty theology, and, that whole separation of church and state thing that goes way back to the Enlightenment. But, after generations of that kind of indoctrination, the hesitancy is understandable. And then once you've been trained not to look to the writings of the popes for answers to, let's say, immigration questions, then you're not going to make this discovery that stuff is there.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So why is it then that the church? Because many people would say, well, isn't the church sort of meant to be solely, concerned with the transcendent, just with Christ, with God, with the above, with the divine, however you want to name it? The church's concerns are with spiritual matters, let's say. Why should the church concern itself with worldly material affairs, such as politics and messy things like politics.
Yeah, and that's a tough question. The principle that I would say is kind of referred to again and again in Western philosophy, goes all the way back to Plato and Aristotle and ancient Greece, so even outside of Christianity, but that the end of political society must coincide somewhat, or at least acknowledge and account for the end of man. And that philosophical tradition and Christianity, especially through, for example, the developments of St. Thomas Aquinas, which is that the end of man, our end, our perfection, is not situated in the material order. It's beyond it. It's in bliss. It's in, to be in the presence of the divine. And so, that's what everything else must reinforce. And unlike the view that separates things out, it would say that a political society that does not allow for that and arrange itself in such a way that it sort of reinforces and acts as a support for spiritual development will inevitably become hostile to it. And so, and another quote from Thomas Aquinas that I read in probably the first book on Catholic social teaching that I ever read, called The Son of Justice by Harold Robbins. A very thin, older book. He was a friend of G.K. Chesterton's, actually. But in the first couple pages of that book, he talks about the simple principle: grace presupposes nature. Mm-hmm. And that has always stuck with me in terms of how to understand why the church not only can, but in a way must be concerned about the social situation. Because if grace presupposes nature, it means that the created world, which is nature, is the context in which we develop ourselves. It's the environment that makes a loving relationship between man and man and God possible. And grace, which God provides to call us to Him and to feed us spiritually, to nurture us, that obviously, in that, when stated in that way, it presupposes a natural environment, a created world in which to work. And so, again, you would, within a religious framework, you really, really care about whether the social situation, the political structures, are a support or a hindrance to spiritual development. So questions like, should we have Sundays off? For the church, it's always been, well, if you're working all day, every day, you need some time to rest and to, see to your own spiritual growth. And that's, you need bodily rest too, but almost bodily rest for the sake of spiritual development and contemplation and your prayer life. And that's something that a secular political order would have no logic built into it to account for something like that. And so, again, that's where you can't sort of just cordon them both off to where they can't speak to each other. And so that's I suppose, a good principle for understanding that necessary concern that the church shows for economics and politics.
So in a way, Catholic social teaching, I mean, in our understanding of man from the Catholic point of view, man is both, the divine soul and the material body. So he is of both worlds. So in a way, the Catholic social teaching is really a means to have both those things connected, but on in the external world. Right. It wishes to enlist both orders, even the material order, in favor of, the spiritual end. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So, I mean, I think this is a big question, because I think undoubtedly, when we're talking about, say, the church's connection to the things that are going on in the material world, they're not really doing so. And I mean, this would be many people's criticism of not just Catholicism, but of monotheistic religions in general, is that they're not really interacting with the problems of the world in the sense of a debate, but they're interacting with them in the sense of they are subordinate to the divine, right? The divine comes first, and everything should be, if things are correct, should be in relation to the divine to increase one's spiritual life, to increase grace, etc. And really, this undoubtedly does point to a hierarchy, right? The idea that there is such a thing as something which is superior to something else. And of course, this is absolutely, almost terminally anathema to the modern world, the modern Western world, right? We are attempting to, failingly, I would say so, attempting to move away from this idea of any superiority at an alarming rate. And do you think there's ever going to be a point where, on a social level, there could be such an acceptance, even of just superiority once again?
I find it really difficult to imagine a sequence of events that would open up that possibility, because, like you said, I mean, the word you used, terminal, is probably very precisely accurate. I don't know that anything short of, I guess if you buy into societies, as a life cycle and something that uses its energy and then collapses and then something different grows up in its place, maybe here where I'm standing, a different civilization will rediscover those things. But I think that, the acknowledgement of hierarchy is something that just comes along with a religious awareness, and in the absence of that, or, past the point of spiritual vitality, when that starts to disintegrate and goes away, I have a hard time, it doesn't nullify the call to try and realize, these truths in society, but I don't think it's, I know that's not really the right answer for a lot of people, but I don't see it happening, no.
So it's almost, and I guess I don't want to enter into a sort of like self-pitying person, self-pitying Christian who feels condemned by society or anything like that. But do you feel it's an uphill struggle which completely internally understands that really it's never going to win, but the point is just to try, for the sake of goodness, to try teach what one believes is correct, not for the sake of, let's say, winning or success, or to revert back to other previous traditional ways of doing things, but for the mere fact of trying to make an effort in the name of the good.
Yes, I think that last is really the value of Catholic social teaching and these principles that may or may not ever be actually realized in their entirety, because you can act on these things in small ways, and maybe you're structuring, your own company that you've built, and you find a way to go against the grain and build in some of these ideas, and that doesn't mean it's futile, just because we can't be purists and refuse to get our hands dirty just because we won't be able to have everything the way that we want it. I think Tolkien described it as the long defeat, where we might see little hints of victory, but we don't get total victory until the very, very end. And I think that's the gist, is that you're as a Christian in general, your approach to life must be that you're fighting for an already lost position, which sounds pessimistic, but it really just acknowledges the vocation of being a prophet who's sort of, calling out in the wilderness. And that's a little bit, dramatic, I guess, to imagine yourself that way. But that can be taken into account as part of the role. That's to some degree what the popes are doing, when they still talk about the immorality of usury. Interest taking, that I cannot imagine the global economy that we have now being premised fundamentally on things like the fractional reserve banking system, which just, it is usury. So the entire system would have to be discarded in favor of a spiritual discipline, almost a rediscovery of social asceticism that puts the enactment of certain moral ideas ahead of whatever economic progress they might enable. And so, to fight as if we're about to have that happen is probably not prudent or realistic, but it doesn't mean that knowledge and, possessing that principle won't allow you to make the world a better place.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. It's interesting you talk about Tolkien and this purism, or this idea of being purists, and I always think of Gandalf when he says, now are the days of the king, now are the days of man, right? They finally sort of won that battle against, in abstract, they've won it against evil, or if you want to read it in the Christian way, which is very easy to do, there's a great book called The Gospel According to Tolkien for that, the battle against Satan. That battle is won, and Gandalf sort of says, now are the days of man, but he says it in such a way, it's like, you get some good times now, but only for a bit, right? This isn't going to last, but even so, it was worth fighting that battle, even if it's just for this sort of momentary few hundred years of respite, which in the grand scheme of things isn't that long.
And I think really, although again that might be framed as pessimism or cynicism, there's value in a view like that because it keeps you humble and it keeps you away from all kind of the danger of utopia, any kind of chimerical hopes that if we just get our way, or if we can just win this election, then we'll have the social system that we need, the perfect one, and we'll get to do what we want, and then everything will be fine. And that's always toxic.
How does the church then manage to not get subsumed into that? Because there's a lot of ideologies out there which generally, once they take root, pretty much nothing can avoid them if they've got a foundation. I mean, capitalism is the one which is so internally inherently flexible that nothing can really escape its grasp. So, and you could argue that certain denominations have been subsumed into it, most definitely. How has Catholicism avoided it, if you think it has?
I think that and there's a couple aspects to that question, but taking, I guess, what ideology is as a kind of oversimplified answers to extremely complex questions. Most of them cannot be solved decisively, but ideology is a modern thing. From everything that I've been able to see of it, it is a response to a certain need. It's, I guess, symptomatic of the modern world. And because what the modern world tells people is that they need to have an opinion on everything. And I think we talked about this in our last discussion, but that everyone in a democracy is supposed to equip themselves, and, they must have the capability, if they're told that they should equip themselves, to basically have a legitimate opinion on about pretty much anything, the conflict in the middle, vaccination science, global warming, immigration, tax policy, whatever it is, no matter how complex and how many decades of actual study you would have in order to be competent on any one of those things. It doesn't matter. What democracies tell people is that, sort of the reins of government are in your hands. And if democracy is going to be democracy, you have to have an opinion about this, and it should be informed, and so that you can vote on it. And that's completely contrary to, any kind of a realistic anthropology. And it puts people in a very, very difficult situation, in that if they're honest, they have to say, I don't know about almost everything that they're supposed to know about. And so along come ideologies, and ideologies like capitalism, it allows you to grapple with these extremely complicated questions in a half a second, because it it just gives you a few principles, and you can just determine immediately if a certain policy coincides with those principles or not. If some policy is being proposed that says, well, in order to, decrease poverty, the government is going to end of story. You don't even have to listen anymore, because for capitalist ideology, the government intervention is always bad, because any intervention in the economy is bad, and poverty is best fought by leaving things alone and letting competition reign. And that's a little bit of an oversimplification too. But every question that starts with should the government intervene in this way is already answered for you. You don't have to know about the history. You don't have to compare different policies that were similar and their effects and whether they worked and what has changed since then. It makes the job of the average man on the street much, much easier. And he can do that. He can't actually be informed about 99% of the questions that are put to him. And ideology allows him to sort of fabricate these opinions on the fly without much thought at all. And of course, they're wrong, but it gives you the confidence by sort of an artificial kind of common sense. And so to get back to your original question, how does the church avoid that? Well, the church is not modern, or at least not entirely modern, and not modern in all of its aspects. In its essence and in all of its teachings, like these Catholic social teaching stuff that we're talking about, it goes much, much further back, and it has no fear of complexity, for one thing. And it has people like St. Thomas Aquinas to write thousands of pages for things that you and I probably would not care to think about to that extent. And so the Catholic Church doesn't need an ideology to save it from all of these questions that the individual doesn't have time to grapple with. So the church is an ancient and a collective body of teachings. And so in a way, its very nature is contrary to the benefit that ideologies offer, which are for individuals with very, very limited, free time.
So quite literally, ideology in the sense that if you're Catholic or a Christian, the questions are somewhat answered for you, but they're answered once again from that transcendent level. And of course, if you aren't a believer, you in a sense you worship whatever fills that vacuum. Whatever the ideology is saying, you agree with it because you've been pulled around by it, and you begin to worship that instead of something higher.
Right, because those ideologies are they provide answers, or they propose to provide answers to every question. They become totalizing, and so it's very difficult once you have really adopted, let's say, capitalist or communist ideology or something along those lines. And there's a difference between saying, oh, I can kind of see, the gist of what capitalist writers are getting at, and I kind of like this idea here, and I kind of like this idea. That's not to be a disciple of an ideology. Ideology is when it becomes total, and it becomes the set of principles that you use to basically interpret the world around you. And obviously that's almost the same definition as religion. So you can't really, it's very difficult to allow religion to speak once you have become a disciple of ideology in the way that I just described.
So in that sense, really we're going back to the origin of man in the Christian sense, in the way that as we eat the forbidden fruit of gnosis, we enter into we move away from the objective divine knowledge to a subjective knowledge, right? When we eat that fruit, we that's the first person who's saying, no, actually, I think I'm going to do my own thing. I believe this thing over here instead of what has been revealed to me. And that seems to be what all ideology is saying, all right, well, that thing you've got looks good, but, you know, we're going to offer you something better. And they find ways to basically make sin appealing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. And I think that one of the biggest problems is that it's deafening. And like you said, once you recede into the subjective, it makes it very hard to discern the objective, because that's all you can see. And of course, that's what the church spends a lot of its time teaching is objectivity and an objective morality, and that these are principles that sort of transcend taste and temperament.
Mm. But then it's almost like there isn't anything, not in the sense that we think of it. There isn't really such a thing as the modern individual subjective. You know, everyone likes to think, oh, I'm a free thinker, or as Christopher Hitchens used to say, you know, it's more fun and more truth to be a free thinker or an individual thinker. Or people say, oh, I think for myself. But really, in that sense, what most people consider to be subjective is simply the most alluring or persuasive form of ideology. Right? If those thoughts hadn't been put, or those ideas hadn't been put in front of them, then that supposedly subjective free thought of the individual wouldn't actually have appeared. It's not really from them. It's from an ideology which makes it seem as if it's from the individual.
Mm-hmm. Yes, I would say thinking for oneself is, to some extent, a delusion. That it's more a matter of knowing your influences and knowing who your teachers are than it is, you know, how much you think for yourself. Because if you insist on thinking for yourself, then no one's going to really know anything. And so, and again, the hyper individualism of, you know, today's political philosophy is again, I think it's kind of like building your anthropology on the basis of political ideas that you found very appealing, instead of building your political ideas based on what you know about people, you know, instead of starting with anthropology. And, you know, because if you started with anthropology, you'd see a lot of limits. You'd see a lot of the ugly side of people. You'd also see that people depend on one another, and that, you know, as soon as you're out of the womb, you're under the influence of others, and you're being taught by others, and you depend on others, and it's this reciprocal relationship. And listening to all of the, I guess, lofty principles of modern political philosophy, there's no accounting for the social aspect of man being a social animal. And that is a huge problem for Catholicism in particular, since it addresses itself to, you know, man as a unity, in addition to man as an individual. It's sort of two sides of the same coin.
And in terms of this, many people will be thinking around that, you know, this notion of the hyper individual. Many people will be thinking around the sort of immediate problem that I guess probably the church probably struggles with. I think maybe, I don't know, I don't want to say the most, but it's a big problem, is the notion of freedom. Because immediately as you start, especially as we've said, in our current hyper-individualist culture where everyone believes they think for themselves, everyone believes that the ultimate good really is to have basically unalloyed personal freedoms, right? You can just have sex with who you want, you can eat what you want, you can do what you want. Like, as long, you know, the go-to virtue is, as long as it doesn't harm someone else, you can just do it, right? And mm-hmm. So, and that is the contemporary liberal modern definition of freedom. And mm-hmm. unfortunately, that's pretty much not what freedom is for the church. And of course, you have this struggle because people, as we've spoken about with superiority and this idea of someone saying, no, you can't do that, and here's why. You have this immediate struggle of people who would say, well, what about my personal freedoms? So I will ask you that, Daniel. If we are enter into Catholic social teaching and take it seriously, what about I'll play devil's advocate, quite literally. What about my personal freedoms? What about freedom?
Sure. So, and I guess there's a couple levels there that I'll speak to. But first, to situate, you know, freedom within Catholic philosophy or Catholic values. I guess, the first thing you notice is that it's not a supreme value in contemporary political ideas. It is the value against which all other things are measured, so that it's this supreme value, and any other idea or action is valid only insofar as it doesn't offend personal freedom. And while freedom and personal freedom is present and is a value for Catholicism and Catholic social teaching in particular, it's not an absolute value. It is subordinate to various other things, first and foremost, being the good. And that's why, even going back to, the Gospels and the epistles of St. Paul, you hear a lot about freedom, but it's always freedom from sin. And it's usually coupled with slavery to Christ. And that's not very flattering and is, like you said, very, very different from what we crave today and what we're told we deserve today. Because it basically puts very strict limits on the freedom that Christianity considers valid. It's freedom of a certain kind. It's freedom to do what you're supposed to be doing, freedom to pursue the good, and never freedom to do evil. And that's such a stark contrast, because it enlists freedom in the context of the good life. Whereas today, you might hear really good, well-intentioned people say things like, maybe with a tear in the eye, I don't believe in what you said, or I don't agree with what you say, but I'll die for your right to say it. And that's very disturbing for someone who takes the alternative view, because it basically says that evil has gained so much license that it is able to enlist, good people who intend good, but it's almost been able to enlist them in its defense. And that's, biblically, that's not the case. And it's a very restricted type of freedom with a vector. And that's by and large how Catholicism interprets political freedom. But it does allow it as a good. And insofar as it does not offend the good, and insofar as we, the dignity of humanity, as taught by Catholicism, does demand that we are sort of left to ourselves whenever possible, then it's permitted. It's not anti-liberty, but it's liberty situated within a different hierarchy of values where liberty is not at the top. And that's the religious side of it. But even for those who don't go in for a strict religious morality, even in a practical sense, the type of liberty that we imagine, that we're taught to imagine today, is completely untenable. Because, if the modern political actor is just sort of this atom, isolated, and maybe a cluster of rights would be a better way of putting it. And I'm a cluster of rights, and that sort of, those are properties that I possess. And freedom is me being able to exercise those rights unobstructed. And as long as I'm sort of, staying within the bounds of these rights, I should not be interfered with by the government or anyone else. And if anyone interferes with me, it must be an injustice. They are doing an injustice to me if they interfere with me. And that's another example of building your view of man, your anthropology, based on certain political ideas. Because if you just look at the way we are as social beings, there is no way that my exercise of my cluster of rights is not going to eventually get entangled with someone else's exercise of their legitimate rights. And so that even if everyone is acting, in a sense, justly according to this view of, my collection of rights, conflicts are going to arise. And so you're going to have the constant perception of injustice that is really inevitable. And so it's set up for failure from the start. And then there's the secondary problem that the rights are always multiplying, right? So So your cluster of rights is growing and growing, which means that the government's job as mediator of rights is becoming more and more complicated and more doomed to fail, because you've got all these people with more and more, quote, rights that are bumping into each other more and more, and it just becomes chaos. And then, of course, everybody's going to hate the government and blame certain groups, but really it's just a problem of an unrealistic view of human social action.
Mm-hmm. It's interesting what you said right at the start. People's general sort of negative pushback against this idea of being a slave to Christ, or being subordinate to God. Once again, this idea of superiority. But of course, no one ever really thinks to have that to consider what it is to be free, in the sense that you've mentioned, that freedom to do one thing is also freedom to not do another. So to be a slave to Christ is equally then not to be a slave to various other things. But to not be a slave to Christianity is to equally be a slave to many other things. And I think it was David Foster Wallace who said, if you worship beauty, you'll always be ugly. If you worship money, you'll always be poor. There's basically two, it's a double-edged sword, right? Freedom is a double-edged sword, and you can never avoid that. And it's, in that sense, it's, there's a reason then to align yourself with that other thing, with the good.
Yes, exactly. And it gives you some sort of a way of avoiding the chaos and the aimlessness of not knowing what to do with your freedom. And that's all that really Catholicism, but also Western philosophy, and as far as I understand them, the philosophy of other religions and other cultures, is that you need a context and a worthy goal to pursue. Otherwise, it's not a healthy or a happy existence. And to not know what to do with your freedom, and to not sort of be bound or to bind yourself with a certain framework that says, it's freedom to realize the good in the best way that you can. And yes, you will have unique contributions to bring to that project, but that is the goal nonetheless. So you won't be micromanaged per se, but there's, it's not this purely negative concept of the absence of interference.
Where with this idea of Christian freedom, there is an aim, there is a purpose to direct it towards the good life. Alternatively, what do you think if you think there is such a thing, what do you think the aim of the other type of freedom is? The current freedom of the Western world. Do you think there is an aim? Do you think there is a teleology to that, just unbridled freedom?
I don't think there is. And I think that is the biggest problem, or at least pretty close to the biggest problem of why we're so, I guess, unhappy and frustrated, is that in a way, when people come together to form a community, if it's going to be a valid community, there should be a shared vision of the good. And that is the whole reason for being of the community, is to pursue that vision of the good together. Mm-hmm. And, if there are legitimate, if there's not a one size fits all structure for all communities, and if there is a diversity of, cultures out there, and if that's healthy, it's because different people can pursue the good in slightly different ways. But as a community, you have to have a shared vision of the good, or else you don't know what to pursue. And that was, again, the Greek and the Catholic view. And of course, for Catholics, that vision of the good that is supposed to be shared by society and pursued together is, bliss in the presence of the divine. But when you discard that and you said, well, what is the end? What is the goal? In a way, it was like with the liberal enlightenment and this new political philosophy, it was like we're not going to have an agreed upon goal. Everyone else should sort of entertain that privately in their own minds. And on a social level, we're just going to agree that we should have freedom. And we don't need an end game, I guess, to pursue together. We don't need the good. We just need freedom. And so I guess you could almost say that liberal political philosophy, in the sense of the Enlightenment, is like a truncated politics. It's not even a complete politics. It's part of a politics that stopped when it found a means, but it never defined the end. So I guess we're seeing the consequences of that, which is kind of sort of the opposite of cooperation, and it's atomization. This decomposition of society is basically what you could probably logically expect when you refuse to acknowledge any kind of a goal.
Maybe it's because I always like to use the language of the devil and evil and things like this. It just sort of seems, as the father of lies, this idea of just keeping everyone completely confused in, an absolute mass of contradictions, so you can never really get an anchoring. Just seems to basically keep everyone away from the truth.
Mm-hmm. Yep. It's I guess if it was a propaganda tactic, it'd be destabilization and keeping people away from each other. And, that was actually, if you're a Tocqueville fan, he wrote a lot about that, how fostering distrust in societies, and he said that was a great danger when he was visiting the United States, was that, individualism, he talked about individualism and how each was supposed to think for themselves and they weren't supposed to rely on others, and how it created the danger there was of social distrust and separating people from their peers. So extreme individualism. And that was very, very powerful for the governing authority. And so ironically, for a people that pursue liberty and individualism, that's actually the best way to sort of empower the government, because actually social unity is one of the only ways that you can slow the growth of government. But that's also the reason I say all of that is because that same language could be used in the way that you're speaking of, how does Satan promote evil and get evil ingrained in society and make it, difficult to overcome. And same concept by keeping people separate, by making it to where every person, thinks they think for themselves and doesn't have to bond with each other and trust each other. And it has the same results.
So what is the sort of correct relationship, you think, between the church and between the Catholic Church and the state?
So I guess the paradigm that the church itself uses is it speaks of man as body and soul, not one or the other. And so human society is also, has bodily concerns and then concerns of the soul. And it describes itself, the church is the soul of the social body. And so it basically wants to be it claims for itself authority in all things religious and moral. So questions of religion and morality are things that the church wishes to address. And this does not mean, I guess, that it's going to micromanage the state, that, having a relationship does not mean, and even if the relationship is hierarchical, doesn't have to mean micromanagement. And where they stop is in the proposal of principles. And that's what the book that we're discussing tries to outline. And that's if it seems to give an impression of even-handedness, it's because I try to share the principles of Catholic social teaching, which stop short of applications. And sometimes it's a fine line, but the church teaches certain principles, like the principle of private property, the universal destination of goods, but it stops there. And it leaves it to political society and, specialists the vocations, to find applications of those principles. So that's why Catholicism can address itself to, various social orders that could be drastically different in form. And it only cares that the particular applications chosen on the granular, the concrete level, are legitimately taking account of the principles that it's the job of the church to protect and promote.
Okay, I mean that's fairly straightforward. So one thing, obviously the subtitle of your book, A New Synthesis, Rerum Novarum to Laudato Si. One thing I did want to comment on, because there's been quite a lot of talk about Laudato Si, is just how this has affected the Catholic Church's sort of relationship to nature, and maybe your thoughts on, I guess the Vatican II stuff, if you want to comment on that stuff.
Yeah, sure. I don't know how far into Vatican II. That's a very difficult subject. I will see if I can comment on that a little bit. First, though, Laudato Si. The first thing that you run into is, at least in my context here in the U.S., is that you've got people, the left saying, finally a pope who's going to, acknowledge the environmental crisis and who's going to, make that an actual topic of discussion. And then on the right, you've got, oh no, it's a renegade pope who's finally going to acknowledge the environmental crisis. And they're both, the first problem to solve there, the first misconception, is that no, he's not the first person to talk about this. And you can find plenty of quotes from, Benedict XVI, who was, generally considered a more conservative pope. But most of everything that Pope Francis elaborates on in his encyclical on the environment can be found in popes like Benedict. So it's not like he's some revolutionary. The only thing that is distinct about it is that he produced this encyclical for that subject specifically. So yes, he did bring it into the limelight, but the people who act like he's saying revolutionary things, it's sort of a reversal of the proper Catholic view of things. So that's just ignorance of the literature. So I thought it was great. I enjoyed it because I'm kind of an aesthetic person, kind of, I guess, a little bit of a poetic bent. And so, that's the sense that disrespect for the environment really, on a personal level hits me, is that I really appreciate nature as a contemplative support, I suppose, as so many various ways of appreciating beauty, because beauty has epistemological value, it has intellectual content. So any impoverishment of beauty, and this is what Pope Francis says as well in so many words, is that any impoverishment of beauty in our surroundings inhibits our ability to sort of approach the truth. Because you've got, famous scriptural citations that we know of God through things that are made, through the contemplation of things that are made. And the more we destroy, the less we have the ability to, contemplate the spiritual by way of these concrete symbols. So it's an impoverishment of human spiritual possibilities. Every species that goes extinct or anything like that, every lake that becomes polluted. So that was really nice to read in that encyclical, was just kind of bringing concern for beauty itself and the spiritual value of beauty front and center. But in addition, the purely moral aspect that if you have a responsibility to love others, and if we are custodians and not just pillagers of the material world, if it's a garden that we are to beautify, then we have a responsibility to those coming after us as well to sort of bequeath it to them in a way that is still useful to them and in good condition. You can't say you love your kids if you just leave your property, their inheritance, in total disgusting disrepair. So again, nothing revolutionary in what I'm saying either, because these are pretty standard, I guess, environmentalist politics. But some of them, going a little bit too far in the extreme and showing certain misunderstandings of priority of values. And so the benefit of Pope Francis was just giving sort of an official Catholic expression to where that should be situated.
That's sort of an emphasis of much of the teaching in a way, is this idea of, I guess, understanding your aim in life in with regards to people which are sort of beyond it, the dead in the case of respect to the dead, but also the yet to be born, in the sense of leaving them something, as you've said, which isn't completely trashed.
Mm-hmm.
And any aim without that, I guess, is really entirely selfish.
Exactly. And it's kind of, everything in the material world in a way can instruct us. And that's another, the questions of how do we understand our body? And it's the same set of concepts, or at least analogous to how do we understand, the importance of the material world, and that its form and its function has a moral, aesthetic, and therefore educational value as given to us. And it's not just completely our possession to, you get a house, and if you want to knock it down and build up a different house, it's your property, and so you get to do that. But to view the body in the created world as your property that you can demolish and put in a parking lot if you want is not quite true. Everything, again, kind of like freedom, has its limits, and you must respect the fact that your custodianship of the body and of the world it's not absolute, and that you are supposed to be benefiting from certain givens in those things.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Okay. Well, I feel we've covered a lot of the sort of the abstract questions which are based around Catholic social teaching. I mean, is there anything you'd like to add about your book or Catholic social teaching in general? You feel we've missed? Obviously, there's a lot more to it.
Sure. Well, I think I will comment briefly on Vatican II. I'll be daring, and I don't think that the interpretation that I'm gonna offer here real quick is anything too fringe. I will say that I don't know that this is exactly something that could be taken verbatim from an encyclical. Most of the things that I say in the book, and at least I try, are not my interpretations. It's not. I try to be able to back up anything that is said in the book, and that's why there's so many footnotes. There's footnotes everywhere in there. And so I will say that when you deal with Vatican II, it's one of the hardest parts is that it's kind of up in the air as to how to interpret it. And part of that is the nature of councils, that it takes a long time before their full significance is known. The full significance of what was put together and done at Vatican II may not really be comprehended yet, because it's subject to the guidance of the Holy Spirit. And so, you have your conscious intentions and the specific words chosen in documents, but what God is doing is not always exhaustively apparent in what happens. And that you do run into the difficulty of Vatican II. And that's why I did want to speak to it a little bit, because as you're reading the encyclicals, if you choose to go out and look at the footnotes, used throughout the book and go read the source documents, and you come to, let's say, Pope Leo the 13th, and you start to read, Libertas or Immortale Dei, where he's talking specifically about relations between the church and the state, and how it's an offense for the church not to confess, it's an offense for the state to be godless, and the state should confess Christianity officially. And it's in no uncertain terms that he's saying that. And what happens is that you get to Vatican II, and there's documents on human freedom saying that no citizen should be coerced into believing or confessing religion that they don't believe in. And so you can bump into what looks like a contradiction of pretty specific official teachings, and then what looks like either sort of ignoring them or downplaying them or outright contradicting them in certain things that were put forward in Vatican II. And it's very sensitive, because some of the things in Vatican II are ambiguous, and there's still people that argue about how exactly they're to be interpreted. But in the way that I have kind of seen it is that if the church is what it says that it is, which is the physician of humanity, and it's there, its whole job is to minister and to treat and to keep us healthy, spiritually, but as is appropriate bodily. And man has gone through certain stages of development in the last few hundred years, and he's not what he was in the Middle Ages. And I guess any good physician is going to take into account how healthy the patient is, for one thing. And, at one stage, the prescription might be watch your diet, don't read these books because these books have bad ideas that are dangerous. And if you read them, then, you'll become sick, and, go back to the days of book burning and banned book lists. And that might have made sense for humanity at a certain point, for that to be the prescription. And then no one listens, and they read the book, certain ideas gain prominence, and the entire civilization transforms, the Reformation occurs, and you get secular nations become the norm. Okay, so that's an entirely different patient. That would be, instead of guiding from danger of possible disease, you've actually got the disease, and the disease is set in. And so the church as physician, the way I see it, has to change its prescription and the way it addresses the people, the faithful, but the world in general. And it can't keep saying the same things it was saying all along, because it's not talking to the same person. And the severity of the sickness is entirely different than what it once was. So, for it to keep talking about how the state needs to confess the one true religion of Christianity, even granting that would be the ideal situation, it's very questionable whether it would be healthy, even if someone were able to make that happen. And I think that in some sense the church discerns that as physician, and so it sort of stops talking about what has become futile and moves into, again, kind of like what you and I talked about, acknowledging lost ground and not contradicting the truth, but kind of emphasizing the aspects of the truth that still stand a chance of being heard. Mm-hmm. And so, again, I'm not allowing the possibility of contradiction. I really don't think it's necessary to pit the church against itself the way some traditionalists would, and I truly am more of a traditionalist mindset. But that has sort of helped me as far as when I was trying to read through all the documentation and really reconcile it, and not have to see any kind of contradiction arise. That made sense to me. So I think that's about as detailed as I'll get with it right now.
Okay. So just out of interest, what do you think sort of happens to churches that just don't budge?
That don't what?
Budge. You know, they just don't move. They never have anything like a council, right? They just adhere to, you know, the original of originals, and they never move from that position.
I think they become sort of dry docked, atomized, and unable to really perform an important part of the function that churches are to perform, because you're there. The church is there to conserve the truth and develop the truth, but it's also there to make it real. And if you have, out of maybe obstinance, compromised your ability to speak to anyone except for your maybe extremely small clique, then you're not really, you're maybe conserving a certain portion of what you're supposed to be doing, but not really acting out the full range of what was the mission. And that doesn't, I hesitate to even say that, because I don't want it to sound like I don't think, the traditional mass ought to be a thing, because I find it very meaningful. So it's not a prescriptive statement, but more of a, if this happens, it's probably not healthy.
Okay. Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah, is there anything you'd like to add about your book?
Oh, no, I don't think so. I think we've covered some really good ground.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Are you currently working on anything new that you'd like to talk about? That is,
I have a pretty extensive work that I've been putting together for years and years, that I hope is going to be sort of a more comprehensive philosophical statement of what Catholicism, the vision of the structure according to Catholicism, that will address a lot more specific questions and include a more specifically theological portion. But that's definitely not forthcoming or right around the corner.
Okay. And we can find all your work on Amazon, correct?
Yes, that is correct.
Okay. Yeah, I think that's a good place to finish up. Daniel Schwindt, thanks very much.
All right. Thank you very much. I appreciate it.